So in today's lecture, I want to look at the nature of misery, and particularly in the Quran, misery is human suffering, and misery is known as or referred to as an ontological condition. It's a deep spiritual condition of the soul. And in today's lecture, and I will make these lectures a series, moving from one topic to the next, but the overall lecture will capture essentially that what this misery is, the causes behind this misery, and look at the opposite existential condition of this misery referred to in the Quran as a sound heart. Now, this opposite of a sound heart is misery, or what the Quran refers to as wretchedness. Essentially, human suffering. Okay, so this will be the topic of today's lecture. I will try to be as brief as possible in terms of my delivery, and then continue in another video that's just as brief. So without further ado, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Now, the Quran says that the natural state of life is one of existential suffering, referred to in the Quran, as I said, as wretchedness or misery. This misery is an ontological one, meaning it exists at the deepest region of the being, of our being, and within the soul of the human being. When looking at what constitutes misery, we would include all of the range of emotions that are negative within the human experience. And I'll list some of them here as merely, not an exhaustive list, but merely a range of them, but they're not exhaustive. So for instance, misery may include negative emotions such as unhappiness, loneliness, a sense of meaninglessness, emptiness, feeling isolated, bored even, restlessness, deep-seated anger or rage, resentments, depression, irritability, wistfulness, which is regretful longing, feeling a sense of incompleteness, not feeling whole, worrying, regret, heartache, fearfulness, cowardliness, feeling worthless, or having feelings of worthlessness. One might even feel a void in one's being, doubt, despair, sadness, paranoia, anxiety, forgetfulness, heedlessness, ignorance, arrogance, and all sorts of immorality, or emotions that lead us to that. Feeling vengeful or lacking empathy. And of course, the list goes on. But these are just brief introduction to all of the emotions that may constitute or lead to a sense of feeling miserable, okay, or wretched in life. In chapter 20, verse 117, the Quran says about Adam and Eve. It says that we said, O Adam, verily this is an enemy to thee and thy wife, so let him not get you both out of the garden, so that thou art landed in wretchedness. Now, of course, here the Quran is referring to him being the devil or the shaitan, as is said in Arabic. And the shaitan, as we know, belongs to another creation known as the jinn creation. And the jinn, according to the teachings of the Quran, as Muslims already know, have the ability to influence human thought and emotion to the extent that they're able to cause them to act and behave in certain ways, which ultimately lead and play into their own suffering. And so God was saying here that be careful of this creature, right? Even in paradise, he had access to Adam and Eve. And God says that this creature, this creation, some among them, and particularly the devil himself, is an enemy to the human creation, and in this case, Adam and Eve. And so God says that be wary of him. And God says that don't let him get you out of the garden, because if you allow him to do that, you will land in a state of wretchedness, a state of misery. And this becomes the narrative that begins with Adam and Eve, but then continues as a narrative and as a warning for human beings as well. And inshallah, we will get to that. Now, in the Al-Mizan tafsir, wretchedness, or the term wretchedness, is translated as shaka. And this word shaka is an Arabic word that means drudgery or tiredness. And that tafsir says that it essentially refers to, and I quote, fatigue that Adam and Eve would experience because of the need to earn a livelihood in this world. So in other words, it's saying that God is saying, oh Adam, be wary of Shaitan, or the devil. Don't let him get you out of the paradise, because if he gets you out of the paradise by you obeying him or following him, then what would happen is you would land in a state of misery. And here Al-Mizan is saying, no, this misery is one that is resulted in the fact that they're no longer in paradise. Now they have to be in a completely different environment. And so fending for themselves, seeking their own livelihood, would result in this fatigue and tiredness. And essentially, this would be considered a state of wretchedness or a state of misery. Yet, in a similar verse, God warns mankind as well, as he has warned Adam and Eve. So in chapter 7, verse 26 to 27, God says, O children of Adam, so all of humanity, let not Shaitan, this same being, tempt you as he tempted your parents, Adam and Eve, to leave the garden, stripping them of their raiment to show them their nakedness. And in verse 27, it says, but the raiment of righteousness, that is the best raiment. In the Quranic commentary of Al-Mizan, Al-Mizan translates the phrase raiment of righteousness in this verse as the garment of God-weariness. Now, and it says that this garment of God-weariness constitutes essentially God's advice and commands to us. So in other words, God is saying that the best raiment of righteousness is the commandments and advice given to us by God. This is what Al-Mizan is ultimately saying. Now, because of how Al-Mizan defines wretchedness as fatigue or drudgery, a type of tiredness that results from having to find one's own livelihood, this perspective then fails to acknowledge that it is in fact when the raiment itself is stripped, right, due to disobedience of God, that the state of wretchedness or misery follows. This idea is clearly deduced from God reminding not just Adam and Eve, but the whole of humanity as well, not to let what happened to our parents, Adam and Eve, happen to us, with the only conclusion that we too, of course, would be landed in wretchedness and misery. The raiment of righteousness then must be seen as a spiritual reality, a condition once lost results in misery. And the idea of raiment being a spiritual reality wasn't entirely or isn't entirely lost on the tafsir of the study Quran, in which it translates the phrase raiment of righteousness as, and I quote, a combination of pious qualities such as faith, modesty, righteous deeds, beautiful comportment, and fear of God. It states that these constitute reverence or taqwa, unquote. Thus, raiment of righteousness itself refers to a reality that can be either present or absent from the human soul. It's something that can be stripped. And for this reason, God warns us not to lose it, right? As was lost with our parents, right? Remember, the verse says that he stripped them, right? And of their raiment and revealing to them their nakedness. So this raiment of righteousness is referred to as the most honorable in other places in the Quran. So for instance, in chapter 49, verse 13, God addressed all mankind and he says, O mankind, verily the most honored of you in the sight of Allah is he who is the most righteous of you. And so we know from this that this raiment is our spiritual raiment. And God has said that we need to protect it. It was something that was stripped of Adam and Eve in obeying or being tempted by this creature or the devil. And God warns mankind that we also need to protect ourselves in the same manner with this raiment, which in his eyes is the best and most honorable spiritual condition. I want to leave it there for today. In the next video, I will be looking at what is the nature of this misery or wretchedness that the Quran refers to, and we will discuss further how we can, the causes of this misery. We will discuss further, the very causes of this misery and suffering. Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum for now.